John chapter 9, and it is a story of a blind man who receives his sight, which is great because Jesus is just coming off of chapter 7 and chapter 8, which, if you remember, chapter 7 and chapter 8 is centered around the Feast of Tabernacles, and the people of Israel are building these temporary dwelling places, and they're living inside of them for 1 week in hopes of remembering what it was like to be a nation that wanders through the desert, wondering, like, how is God going to, and watching how God is going to provide and deliver. And so as they dwelled inside of these tabernacles that they had built for the week, they would do different celebrations, water celebrations, light celebrations, to remember the events as they go through the desert. For instance, the water, where they would go out and they would grab water from the pool of Siloam and dump it over the altar, and it would be a reminder that God provided water from a rock, right? And that God was going to provide water in the future, right? And so as they're preparing for the next season with planting and harvesting, and they'd be praying for rain, and God provide rain for us. This Feast of Tabernacles was looking at that. And Jesus said that if anybody is thirsty, they can come to me and I will give them living water, right? By this, he was talking about the Holy Spirit. So water becomes a theme that Jesus is saying that he fulfills out of that Feast of Tabernacles. The next sign or symbol would be light, right? Jesus says, if anybody comes to, I'm the light of the world. And anybody who comes to me will not have to dwell in darkness again, right? Jesus is claiming to be the fulfillment of that hope that the people had as they wandered through the desert. Jesus is the light of the world. And just as they wandered through the desert, followed by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, they didn't have to walk in the darkness. God was with them as they went through the desert. And Jesus is promising to be the fulfillment of that, to give us light so that we can see, light so that we can be revealed. His word, like a lamp into our feet, a light into our path. Jesus fulfills that role, right? And so we see in chapter 7 and chapter 8, Jesus fulfilling this tabernacle hope as they remembered their time in the wilderness. And then we get to chapter 9, and we're going to witness a miracle or a sign that points to these same things, right? In chapter 9, we see Jesus giving sight to a blind man. And I'm just going to read the most of the story. So if you guys just turn to it and look at it with me, I'm just going to go through a good chunk of it. Here's what it says. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And after saying this, he spit on the ground and made some mud with the saliva and put it into the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. The word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, No, he only looks like the man. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened? They asked. He replied, The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it into my eyes. He told me to go into Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. Then they brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud in my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, How can a sinner perform such a sign? So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, He's a prophet. I'm just going to stop there. We're going to go through more of it, but I'm hoping you guys see the story itself, because it's a really special story about Jesus giving sight to a blind man. Or if you want to take the metaphors that he was using in chapter 8, Jesus is giving light to somebody who is living in darkness, right? So we're seeing a very real showing of what Jesus claimed about himself. I am the light of the world, and anybody who comes to me will never have to walk in darkness. This story was really important to that early church. In fact, if you go to Rome and go into the catacombs, you're going to find paintings all over the wall. This will be among one of the paintings, because this story was so special to that early church. And you might ask why. Like, why is this story such an important story? And the reason it is because this is actually the story of us, right? I mean, it's a very real person. He's a blind man who Jesus gave sight, but it's also the story of you and me who were once living in darkness and then got to come into the light. And when we're in the light, we don't have to walk in darkness anymore. So it's a real story about us, but it answers some questions that early church might have had, like questions like how do we come to Jesus in the first place? What do we have to do? How will following Jesus affect our social life and our social status? When it does, how are we supposed to respond to that? And when I feel alone, is Jesus going to leave me out there alone? Like, these are all questions that early church would have been faced with, because coming to Jesus was very much a big deal to them, right? They were leaving their former life and going on to live a new life, which had ramifications throughout the rest of their life. And so this story is going to answer some of those questions for them, but it's also answering questions for us. So are you guys excited to find all these answers? You can't wait, I can tell, right? So here's the first point, and the first thing that I think we can see from this story. The first thing that we can see is that living in the light requires obedient faith. So just write that down if you're taking notes. Living in the light requires obedient faith. And here's why I say it. Jesus is actually walking by. He's walking along the road, and he sees this man who is blind from birth. Now, isn't that cool? Jesus picks him out. Again, we see Jesus picking out somebody who is blind, and he's blind from birth. And I think we have to understand, like, the social ramifications of being blind, right? Today, like, modern science has taken away a lot of the isolation that would happen because you were born blind or because you were blind. I mean, you have seeing eye dogs, you have special glasses. Most of you all have glasses, so you're not among the blind class, right? But Jesus is finding somebody that would have been seen as an outcast, because blind people weren't just seen as people with infirmities, people who were struck with blindness. In fact, most people in this time actually believed that they were blind because God had caused that to happen. God chose for that to happen. Or maybe it was a product of somebody's sin, right? And so when you say, oh, blind man, you're not just walking by somebody who's struck with blindness. You're walking by somebody who you are already labeling and saying this person is a sinner. Or his parents were a sinner. Like, who sinned, this man or his parents? In fact, if you look at this story, that's what the disciples ask. He saw a blind man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind, right? It's a messed up understanding of God that comes from this Old Testament. Like, there's some scriptures that back this up, like Exodus 20, I'm going to pay the sins of the parents onto the children for the generations to come. But if you read that verse, it's actually a balancing act, like a scale. Like, God is going to be so much more merciful than he is going to be showing his anger, his wrath, right? If you read the verse, he's far more merciful than he is full of wrath. Anyway, there's wrong understandings. We know people don't suffer simply because of sin. Now, when I say simply because of sin, we know suffering, blindness, infirmities, sicknesses, they're in the world because of sin, but they're this sin of Adam, right? They're in the world because of sin, and from that sin, all the earth is groaning, longing for the day of its redemption. But if somebody is born blind, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's because their parents sinned or because they had sinned. And sometimes we feel like that, right? Like, why is this happening to me? You ever feel like that? As you're going through some kind of problem, you just want to, you naturally want to understand the reason why you're going through the problem. And so you begin to blame things. Like, maybe it's because of some kind of sin in my life. Maybe it's because of something I've done. Like, Paul feels like this. He has a thorn in his flesh, right? And he says to God, I prayed. Or he says in Scripture, I prayed, and God said to me, my grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect in weakness. And so the question isn't, why is this man blind? But what can God do about the blindness? Like, that's the bigger question. That's why Jesus says to his disciples, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. I'm just going to say something real quick, and I'm not going to get out in the weeds on this. The words, this happened, aren't in the original Greek. It starts with so, right? The NIV puts it in there, so it might make a little more sense to us, but it's not in the Greek. It doesn't say this happened so. It just says, The original Greek just says, so the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent us. Right? So the NIV threw it in there, not really in there, but I don't want to get too far deep in that. I just want to point it out. Right? And so Jesus is saying, no, it's not about the why you're suffering. It's about what God can do about the suffering, the works that are going to happen in the suffering. And I'm telling you, sometimes when I'm going through things, that's what I'm looking for, right? I mean, we can all question, why is this happening? The bigger question is, what is God going to do? And I know some of you guys are going through things. In fact, I know we're all going through things. And the question is, what is God going to do? What is the outcome? What is the purpose of all of this? And Jesus has a purpose in this. He's going to display the works of God in this man's life, right? This happened. Or so that the works of God might be displayed in this life, I must do the work while there's still day, right? And so what Jesus does is kind of cool, but kind of disgusting. I'm hoping you guys see that. Jesus takes spit, right? Like, this is not the kind of healing that I want to happen. Jesus, like, here's this man. He's blind. He can't see anything. Maybe you can imagine that, but Jesus hasn't said anything to him yet. And all he hears is the footsteps of Jesus walking up, and then he hears right there in the clay, right there in the mud, and then he rubs it together, and he puts it on the man's eye. I just don't know if you guys could imagine that scene, not knowing what is going on, not knowing the man that just walked up to you, and all of a sudden you hear him spit in the dirt and wipe mud on your eyes, and you're thinking, ew. Actually, I don't know if they were thinking, ooh. Saliva was probably I read about saliva more than I wanted to this week, and it was part of the healing process. People would spit on each other. They thought it worked. Maybe there was something to it. I don't know. But Jesus spits, and out of the clay he makes some dirt, and he puts it on the man's eyes, and then he says, "Go and wash in the pool of Siloam." Notice at this point, the man still hasn't seen Jesus because he's blind. He doesn't know who Jesus is. He just knows this stranger has walked up to him, spit on the ground, and wiped the dirty spit on his eyes, and says, "Go and wash yourself in the pool of Siloam." Now, if that happened to you, would you guys be obedient? You'd be running. I'd be going to get the spit off my eye. You'd be wondering, what is this all about? But maybe just in faith, maybe in hope, right? The assurance of things hoped for. Maybe in hope, you're like, this might work. And what else do I got? And so the man goes and washes himself in the pool of Siloam. That's why my first point is that living in the light requires obedient faith. This man could have stayed right where he was at with muddy, dirty eyes, and he would have remained in darkness. But instead, he's told to go and wash himself in the pool of Siloam. And if you look at your Bible, it's really interesting that John takes a minute and he says, this word means sent. That's in verse 7. He says, go, he told him, wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. And then for his audience, he says, this word means sent. And I was thinking all week, why does John do this? He doesn't explain the name, the meaning behind the names of the rest of the places that he goes, but he's specific about this name. He says, this pool means sent. And it's just a really interesting side note, especially remembering that over 20 times in the book of John, Jesus is called the one who is sent. Right? So let's just look at a couple verses where that happens. In John chapter 3, verse 17, we've all read this a few times since we've been going through John, but verse 17 says this. It says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." Also in verse 34, it says, "For the one whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for God gives the Spirit without limit." Also in chapter 5, verse 36, he says the same types of things. Here's what he says. "I have a testimony weightier than that of John, for the works that the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I am doing, testify that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself testified concerning me. You have never heard his voice nor seen him, nor does his word dwell in you, for you do not believe in the one he has sent. So I don't think that John just puts this idea of washing yourself in the pool of Siloam. By the way, that means the one that is sent, without like having a bigger meaning behind it. See, that's answering that question. How do we come to Jesus in the first place? We have to trust, right? This man just spit in my eyes. He says, go. Okay, I trust that I'm going to go. We have to wash ourselves in the pool that describes his very identity. He is the one that is sent. And we come out able to see, living in light. See, that's what it is. That's the same thing that all of us have hopefully gone through, right? We've lived in the darkness of sin. We've come to hear about this message of the gospel, right? Good news concerning the death, burial, and resurrection, that sin no longer has any victory over us. We trust in that, and we go and we wash ourselves in the pool of the one who was sent, and we come back and we can see, right? Like that's the story. That's answering that question for that early church. What do I have to do, right? But guess what? Once you make that decision, man, the world's coming against you. That's what happens. The world just comes against you. That's why my second point is that living in the light may bring trials, right? I just want to point out in verse 7, after it says go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed, and then he came home seeing. Where did he go back to? His home. His life had been changed, right? He'd been set free from blindness. He's in the light. His life has changed, and he goes back home, and he runs into trouble. Isn't that what happens to us too? Right? In fact, let's look. His neighbors, verse 8, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened? They asked. Like this is what happens when we allow our life to be transformed, right? When we wash ourselves in the pool of the one who is sent and we go back home, everybody should see the difference. And if everybody doesn't see the difference, then get back in the pool, man. You didn't get the mud off, right? Like it's just, look, I'm not saying that everybody will agree that there's a difference. I'm not saying everybody will even believe that there's some kind of difference. In fact, there are some people that said this isn't the same man. But remember, these are the people that are closest to him, his neighbors, those people that walked by him every day. They're saying, no, this isn't the same man. This is somebody completely different. Don't try to pull that. And then others said, yeah, maybe it is the same man. I wonder what happened. See, when we allow ourselves to be transformed by Jesus, the people around us will see it. They'll either see it and deny that it exists, or they'll see it and they'll trust. But either way, people should see the change in you. People should see, like this man, he was blind, but now he sees. And I don't know what kind of darkness you've come out of, but people should see the change in your life. And not everybody will accept it. Not everybody will believe it. That's all right. You're not doing it for them anyway, are you? No. No, you're doing it for God. You're doing it for Jesus because he sent you to be transformed, to be changed into the image of his son, to live in the light. And so you're doing it for him anyway. So regardless, when you go back home and you've been transformed, you've been taken from darkness to light, it doesn't matter what people think because you're living in the light regardless. And so he goes back, right? He goes back to his neighbors, and you can see that where verse 8 talks about verse 9, some claimed he was, and others said no, he only looks like him, but he says, I am the man. And then he tells them how. This is how. The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and to wash. So I was washed, and then I could see. That's the whole, like his whole transformation story. The man they called Jesus put mud in my eyes, told me to wash, so I washed so I could see. Right? And that's all he knows about this person so far. You see how he just calls him Jesus? He's still pretty ignorant in his faith. All he knows is this man that he had never seen walked up to him, spit on some dirt, rubbed it in his eyes, and told him to go wash. He doesn't know what he looks like. He knows what his voice sounds like. And he knows that his name's Jesus, but that's enough because he's been obedient to what Jesus has said. He's gone and he's washed in the pool of the one who is sent. So he goes, but then he stands before the Pharisees. This is what happens next. He's going to stand before the Pharisees. Verse 13, they brought him before the Pharisees, the man who had been born blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. And you guys should be like, uh-oh, we already know this is a problem, right? The Pharisees don't like it when Jesus is working on the Sabbath. And he does work, right? He spits in clay and he rubs it together. That's work. I mean, not a lot, but it's work and too much for the Sabbath. And then he rubs it on the man's eyes. That's work. And then he tells the man to go and wash. That's work, right? So the Pharisees have lots of reasons to be upset. They think that Jesus is breaking the Sabbath, but that's not really the point of this story. Like, John doesn't spend any more time explaining why Jesus has the right to work on the Sabbath. He just shows the man and his testimony as he stands before the Pharisees and he explains how it happened. Here, the Pharisees say this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Then they turned to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes that were opened. The man replied, he's a prophet. Do you see the elevation? He goes from Jesus to now, when he's in front of the Pharisees, he's a prophet. But I just want you to see, like, as you've been transformed, as you've been changed, you go to those closest to you, and some will believe there's a change, and others will reject that there's a change. You might go to those in authority, like the Pharisees, and some will believe that there's a change, and others will reject that there's a change, right? Some will say, this man is really from God, and other people will say, no, if he was really from God, he wouldn't work on the Sabbath. They were divided. And I think that's what happens when we go out and live our faith, when we encounter people, when we're living honestly. Some people will accept it, some people will reject it, but this man doesn't backtrack. In fact, he's progressing forward. Jesus has been elevated from the man they call Jesus to a prophet, right? Same thing happens for us. So when we live out our faith, we encounter trials, sometimes with our family, sometimes with those in authority, our neighbors, those in authority. The next trial is going to be with his family, right? Because the Pharisees don't know or don't believe yet who this man's story, so next they call the parents. And here's what the parents say, verse 18. They still did not believe him, believe that the man had been blind and they had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked? Is this the one you say was born blind? How then is it that he can see? We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know that he is born blind, but how he can now see or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid that the Jewish leaders who already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. Right? This is honor-shame culture. And it's one that Jesus lived in, and it's one that we see all the time around us. Right? And his parents are brought before the Pharisees. What do you believe? And they're afraid to even answer. See, sometimes when we come to Christ, even those closest to us might not stand behind us. They know that it's their son. They know that he was born blind. And I'm pretty sure they've talked to him about how it happened, but they didn't want to acknowledge it because acknowledging it would have ramifications on their own life. And sometimes following Jesus takes that too. See, he says, he's come to bring not always peace, but sometimes a sword, to turn people against one another, right? When we live for Jesus, we may encounter trials. And I think this story, that's why this story held such meaning for those people in early Rome living in the catacombs, because they were people who came to Christ and were pushed out by their neighbors, pushed out of their synagogues. Their parents were starting to turn from them. And they're asking this question, like, what do I do? Do I continue to live out my faith? Or can I just put it into a shadow? so that I can just get along with everyone? And I think you all know the answer is obvious, because the man does not hide behind a shadow, does he? He continues to stay in the light no matter what happens to his life. His neighbors question him. The Pharisees question him. His parents don't stand behind him. Yet he remains faithful. The same thing is happening today for Christians all the time who come to Christ. It has social ramifications in your life. The question is, what are you doing about it? There's a couple other things, but they call him again a second time before the Pharisees. And look at what this man says. They say, give glory to God by telling the truth. We know this man is a sinner. I just point out like how sure those Pharisees are about Jesus. They're sincere, but they're sincerely wrong. We know this man is a sinner, but this is what the man who was born blind says. Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know is I was blind, but now I see. Isn't it great? This man doesn't have all the answers to all the questions. But he's going to give the answers that he knows. He's going to speak the truth that he's experienced. And he won't be able to answer every question that these Pharisees throw at him, but he's going to be able to answer the ones that matter, the ones that he's experienced. And that's us, right? There are some people that are still early on in their faith and they don't have all the right answers. That's okay. There are others that are further along in their faith and they don't have all the right answers either, right? We're all learning. But we can tell you about what we've experienced, and that's why testimonies are so important, because no one can claim your testimony is false. You're telling them about your life, right? And so this man says, I don't know. Maybe he's a sinner, maybe he's not. But I can tell you for sure, I was blind, and now I see. And that we've all gone there, right? We can see. They say this, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. See, there's a dividing line. You have to follow someone. They want to continue to follow and put their trust in Moses. You can't do that. Moses will leave you in the darkness. You have to instead become the disciple. Put your trust in Jesus. And this is what the man says. One last thing about the identity of Jesus. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. This man just elevated Jesus one more time. He's gone from just Jesus to now he's a prophet, and now he is from God. Which wraps up the whole tabernacle theme, right? The whole tabernacle theme is that Jesus is from God, from heaven, taught by God, going back to God. He's this light that's in the world for a moment. And while he's in the world, he must do work while he's in the light, right? And he's done work in all of our lives. Next week, we're actually going to get into Jesus coming back to this man and Jesus speaking with this man and showing him that he doesn't have to be left alone, because I want you to see, before we go into next week, that the man is abandoned and left alone. Look at verse 34. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. That's where this man finds himself. Why? Because he followed Jesus. He did what Jesus had told him to do. He went and he washed himself in the pool of the one who was sent. And he came out able to see, and because of that experience, he had trouble with his neighbors, he had trouble with those in authorities, his parents didn't stand behind him, the Pharisees threw him out, and he's seemingly all alone. But do you think Jesus is going to leave him there? No. Too bad we didn't get to my third point, or you'd know for sure that he wouldn't have. Jesus doesn't leave us out there in the darkness. He doesn't leave us outside of the synagogue. He comes, and it's just a reminder that when we come to Jesus, it's going to have social impact on our lives with our family, our neighbors, those in authority. But that's okay. Don't hide in the shadow because of it. Stay in the light. And as you do that, your perception of who Jesus is will change. It'll go from Jesus to a prophet to surely this man is from God.